The air in the hallway was sharp, too cold for late spring. It smelled of cheap coffee and desperation, a scent I now associate with everything ending. He stood there, tie askew, face slack with disbelief, the color draining from him like water from a sieve. Two men in dark suits, their faces impassive, held folders. One of them, a man named Mr. Davison, cleared his throat, the sound echoing in the sudden silence of the office corridor. Davison's voice was low, professional, utterly devoid of sympathy. "Mr. Sterling," he said, and the name sounded alien coming from him. "As per the terms of the lease agreement for these premises, and following multiple breaches, including but not limited to unauthorized alterations and consistent late rental payments, this lease is hereby terminated, effective immediately." He blinked, a slow, reptilian movement. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. Around him, the normal office hum seemed to pause, then stutter back to life, hushed whispers following the path of the dark suits and the man they were removing. It wasn't just the termination of the lease, it was the manner of it, the cold, public dismantling of his carefully constructed world. His office door stood open behind him, a sterile rectangle revealing a desk piled high with the symbols of his perceived success. Now, those symbols looked like props in a collapsing play. "You have 15 minutes to collect essential personal belongings," Davison continued, gesturing vaguely towards the open door. "Security will escort you from the premises. Any property remaining after that time will be inventoried and stored at a facility offsite, with costs borne by you. Instructions for retrieval will be provided." He finally found his voice, a strangled sound. "What? You can't. This is my office. My business." Davison's expression didn't change. "The lease is in your name, Mr. Sterling. Not your business. And the lease is terminated." He paused, and for the first time, his gaze shifted, finding mine across the short distance of the hall. There was no recognition there, not yet. Just the neutral acknowledgement of another person witnessing the scene. Security. Two large men in guard uniforms stepped forward from the end of the hall. They weren't aggressive, just solid, immovable. They flanked him, their presence a physical manifestation of the finality of it all. He looked from them, to Davison, back to his open office door, then his eyes landed on mine again. This time something flickered. Confusion, then dawning horror. It hit him then. The connection. The silent, invisible threads that bound this sterile hallway, this building, this moment of his utter humiliation, to me. His face went from slack disbelief to a mask of pure, sickening realization. He knew, in that instant, who owned this building. And he knew, with a certainty that must have felt like a physical blow, why this was happening. His eyes, usually so full of mocking confidence, froze. They were wide, glassy, like those of a trapped animal. He couldn't speak. He couldn't move. The man who had mocked me, dismissed me, told me I would be homeless by next month, was standing frozen in the hallway of the building owned by my father, being evicted from the office that was the cornerstone of his arrogance. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, filled only with the distant murmur of the office and the frantic beating of my own heart. It wasn't triumph I felt, not exactly. It was something colder, something sharp and clean, like a broken piece of glass. It was the sound of the world righting itself, one shattered piece at a time. The man who thought he held all the power was powerless. And I, the woman he had tried to break, was standing in the ruins of his certainty, completely unbroken. His frozen stare was the only validation I needed. If you've ever felt this way, trapped or underestimated, tell me in the comments. I read all of them. And if you haven't already, please subscribe, it helps me more than you know. My life, before the rot set in, was quiet. Not idyllic, but stable. Predictable. Like a well-tended garden before the blight arrives. I had a small design business, working from a sunlit room in our apartment. He had his job, ambitious, full of big talk and even bigger promises. We met in that hazy period after college, when the world still felt full of possibility, malleable. He was charming then, quick with a joke, his eyes crinkling at the corners when he smiled. He made me laugh. He made me feel seen. We built a life, piece by careful piece. Furniture from IKEA, painted walls, plants on the windowsills. The mundane, beautiful things that make up a home. There were Sunday mornings with coffee and the newspaper, movie nights curled on the sofa, shared dreams whispered in the dark. I supported his career, listened to his long hours spent detailing his ascent, celebrated his small victories, as if they were our own. I believed in him. More importantly, I believed in us. We were a team. Or so I thought. My father was different. Not emotionally distant, but pragmatic. A businessman. He started with nothing, built an empire, piece by careful piece, brick by brick. He dealt in concrete and steel, in leases and tenants, in the quiet power of ownership. His world was logical, structured, built on contracts and obligations. He rarely spoke of his work, not to me anyway. It was just what he did. A constant, steady presence in the background of my life, like a mountain range you forget is there until you look up. I knew he owned buildings. Many buildings. It was just abstract knowledge, not something that touched my daily life. His success was his own. I was building my own path, my own small business, finding my own way in the world. The shift wasn't a sudden crack, but a slow, insidious erosion, like water wearing away stone. It started subtly. Little criticisms masked as jokes. A rolled eye when I talked about my work. Dismissive comments about my income, even though it paid for our groceries, our small luxuries. He'd say things like, "Cute little hobby," or "must be nice to just doodle all day." At first, I'd laugh it off, thinking it was stress from his job. He was under pressure, he'd say. The market was tough. He was dealing with difficult people. I understood. I was supportive. Then the financial control began. He started managing all the money. My income went into a joint account, but he handled the bills, the budgeting. He'd scrutinize every purchase I made, question every receipt. "Do you really need that?" he'd ask, holding up a bill for art supplies. Or, "We're cutting back." Money's tight. Meanwhile, he'd buy expensive suits, go out for drinks with colleagues, talk about investing in this or that. The rules, I realized slowly, applied only to me. The real turning point, the inciting incident that shattered the illusion completely, came during a particularly bad argument about money. I needed to buy a new piece of software for my design work, an essential tool. It cost a few $100s. He refused. Flat out. Said it was a waste, an unnecessary expense. I pushed back, harder than I had before. I explained it wasn't a luxury, it was necessary for my business to grow, to continue bringing in money. I pointed out his recent expensive watch purchase. That's when his face changed. The mask slipped. The charm vanished, replaced by something cold and ugly. His voice was low, dripping with contempt. "Grow," he sneered. "Your little drawings aren't going to grow into anything. You're dependent on me. You know that, right?" My stomach clenched. "That's not fair," I whispered. "I work hard. I contribute." He laughed, a short, harsh sound devoid of humor. "Contribute? You contribute pocket change. Face it, you're one missed paycheck away from having nothing. If I weren't here, you'd be lost. You'd be on the streets." And then he said it. The words that became the acid etching on my soul. "Honestly," he said, leaning back, a cruel smile playing on his lips, "if something happened to me, you'd be homeless by next month." Homeless. The word hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Homeless. Me? The woman who managed our home, who built her own business from the ground up, who supported him emotionally and practically. Homeless? Because of him. It wasn't just an insult. It was a declaration of power. A statement of ownership, not just over the money, but over my entire existence. He saw me as a liability, a dependent, utterly without agency or resilience. He truly believed that without his glorious presence, I would crumble into dust and end up begging on a street corner within 30 days. The sheer arrogance, the utter dismissal of my strength, my history, my family, was breathtaking. Something inside me snapped. It wasn't a loud, dramatic break. It was quiet, internal, like a microscopic fracture forming deep within a bone. The pain was intense, but it was also clarifying. In that moment, I stopped seeing him as a flawed partner I needed to help or understand. I saw him as an antagonist, an obstacle, a threat. The early struggles after that were internal. I still lived with him, trapped in the gilded cage of our apartment, which suddenly felt less like a home and more like a stage for his psychological warfare. He continued his pattern of control, mixing dismissiveness with occasional, confusing bursts of false affection. It was a classic cycle, designed to keep me off balance, doubting myself. I tried to argue, to reason, to plead. It was useless. He saw my distress as proof of his point. My tears fueled his contempt. See, he'd say, gesturing dismissively. Emotional. Can't handle reality. I started keeping secrets. Small ones at first. Hiding a little money I earned, opening a separate, secret bank account. It felt furtive, shameful, like something a criminal would do. But the fear he had planted, the fear of being utterly destitute, utterly alone, was a cold, persistent knot in my stomach. I started researching. Not just shelters or aid programs, but options. Legal options. What happens when a marriage ends? What are my rights? What are his? The more I learned, the clearer the picture became. He wasn't just being difficult or stressed. This was a pattern, a deliberate, calculated effort to erode my self-worth and make me believe I was incapable of surviving without him. The financial control wasn't about budgeting. It was about power. The mockery wasn't about humor. It was about humiliation. The rising challenges came as he sensed my withdrawal. He didn't know about the secret account, the research, the quiet defiance growing inside me. But he felt the shift. My forced smiles became thinner. My reaction slower. I stopped arguing, not because I was defeated, but because I was listening, watching, gathering information. My silence must have unnerved him. He escalated. He started coming home later, smelling of perfume that wasn't mine. He'd leave his phone face down. The lies became transparent, clumsy. When I confronted him, gently at first, he'd explode. You're crazy. Imagining things. You're paranoid and pathetic. He'd twist my words, turn my concerns into accusations against me. He accused me of being unsupportive, of being a drain, of holding him back. The man who said I'd be homeless without him was now trying to convince me that I was the problem in his life. Everything felt like it was closing in. My small business started to suffer. It was hard to focus, hard to be creative when living under constant psychological siege. Money was tighter than ever, not because he didn't have it, but because he was restricting access, using it as a weapon. The fear of homelessness, the fear he had planted, began to feel less like a distant threat and more like a looming shadow. He seemed determined to make his own prophecy come true. One night, he brought it up again. We were sitting across from each other at the dinner table, the silence between us heavy with unspoken accusations. He'd had a particularly good day, he said. A big deal closed. He was flush with success. His chest was puffed out with self-importance. You know, he said, swirling the wine in his glass, not looking at me. It's amazing how much easier things are when you don't have dead weight holding you back. My fork clattered against the plate. I looked at him, waiting. He finally met my eyes, and the cruelty there was chilling. I was thinking about what I said, about you being homeless. And it's true. You really would be. You have nothing substantial, do you? No real assets. Just me. If I wasn't willing to carry you, he smiled then, a smug, satisfied smile. Lucky for you. I'm a generous guy. Deepening crisis. It wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about survival, about reclaiming my dignity. I felt utterly cornered. Every path forward seemed blocked. Leaving meant facing that fear of destitution he had so gleefully described. Staying meant being slowly erased piece by his contempt. All seemed truly lost. How could I fight back against someone who held such control over my finances, my home, even my sense of self-worth. He had built his fortress of power, brick by brick, accusation by accusation, dollar by dollar. And I was trapped inside with him. The midpoint shift happened the next day. I was walking through the city, trying to clear my head, the weight of his words pressing down on me. I passed by a building, tall and modern, all glass and steel. A cleaning crew was working late, their figures silhouetted against the evening sky. I looked up at the sign, a familiar logo. It was one of my father's properties. And then it hit me, like a physical blow. Not the building itself, but the realization of what owning buildings meant. It meant leases. It meant tenants. It meant contracts and obligations and the quiet, absolute power that comes with being a landlord. My father owned buildings. Lots of them. Commercial properties. Office buildings. Where did my husband work? In an office. Whose office? His. A successful business he always boasted. In a prime location. A cold, clear thought formed in my mind, pushing away the fog of despair. He had built his arrogance on the foundation of his perceived success, his office, his status. He saw this as his kingdom, the source of the power he wielded over me. He talked about his office constantly, the deals made there, the people he met there. It was his sanctuary, his proof of worth. And what if that foundation wasn't as solid as he thought? What if the ground beneath his feet wasn't his own? The idea, once it took root, grew with astonishing speed. It wasn't just about getting away from him anymore. It was about dismantling the very source of his power, the place where he felt most invincible. It was about turning his greatest perceived strength into his greatest weakness. My view shifted entirely. I stopped seeing myself as a victim trying to escape. I started seeing myself as someone with a strategic advantage, hidden in plain sight. My father's business, which I had always seen as separate from my life, suddenly became a potential tool. A powerful, silent weapon. The turning point wasn't asking my father for help. Not yet. The turning point was deciding to use this knowledge, this connection, to fight back. It was a cold, calculated decision. There was no room for emotion, only strategy. I had to find out where his office was located. I had to find out if it was one of my father's buildings. And if it was, I had to find a way to sever his ties to it, to remove the very platform he stood on when he looked down on me. The research began. Discreetly. I couldn't just ask him, obviously. I started sifting through old mail, looking for anything related to his business address. I checked his LinkedIn profile, though it only listed the company name, not the physical address. I needed something concrete. It took weeks. Weeks of living the same strained life, pretending nothing had changed, while secretly digging for information. The tension was immense. Every casual conversation felt like a minefield. He was still cruel, still controlling, but I barely registered it anymore. My focus was entirely on the task. Finding the address. Confirming the building owner. I finally found it buried deep in his email archives. A confirmation email for a new office chair delivery, complete with the full address. My heart hammered in my chest as I typed it into a search engine. And there it was. The building name, the street address, and the owner, listed clearly in online property records. Sterling Properties, LLC. My father's company. The confirmation was electrifying. It wasn't just one of his buildings. It was a significant one, a large commercial tower downtown. My husband, the man who told me I was worthless and would be homeless without him, had built his kingdom, his symbol of success, on land owned by my family. He was a tenant, a disposable entity in the grand scheme of my father's real estate empire. He had probably signed the lease without a second thought, just another piece of paper in the mountain of his business ventures. He had no idea the name on that lease was the same name that signed my birth certificate. The knowledge was a potent mix of disbelief and grim satisfaction. The irony was almost unbearable. All his bluster, all his arrogance, rooted in a place he didn't truly own, didn't truly control. A place that belonged to the very family he conveniently ignored or subtly disparaged because their quiet, real wealth made his flashy, precarious success look small. The decision solidified. This was it. The path forward. It wouldn't be easy. It wouldn't be pleasant. But it was necessary. I needed to involve my father. This was the hardest part. My relationship with him was good, but private. We didn't mix family and business. And explaining everything, explaining the abuse, the control, the sheer, ugly reality of my marriage, it felt like a betrayal of the image of a happy life I had carefully maintained. But there was no other way. He held the key. I called him and asked to meet. Not at the usual casual dinner, but at his office. A formal setting. I needed to approach this like a business matter, clear and concise, because that was the language he understood best. Sitting in his large, quiet office, overlooking the city, felt surreal. He listened patiently as I spoke. I laid it all out. The financial control, the emotional abuse, the threats of homelessness, his contempt. I didn't exaggerate. I didn't cry. I stated the facts, presenting the evidence, the hidden bank account statements showing how he'd siphoned funds, the emails containing his cruel remarks, forwarded from his archive to my secret email, the property records showing his office address, and the building owner. His face remained impassive for a long time. He didn't interrupt. He just listened, his eyes sharp and focused, like he was reviewing a complicated contract. When I finished, the silence stretched. Finally, he spoke. His voice was low, measured. He said you'd be homeless. Yes, I confirmed, my voice barely above a whisper. By next month. He leaned back in his chair, linking his hands. His gaze was steady, meeting mine directly. And his office is in the Sterling Tower. Yes. On the 26th floor. Another pause. Lease in his name. Yes. Are the payments current? I hesitated. This was another layer of his manipulation. He'd often complain about business expenses, cash flow issues, but project an image of booming success. I don't know about the recent ones. He controls all the business finances. My father picked up a phone on his desk, pressed a button. Davison, he said into the receiver. Pull up the lease file for Suite 2605, Sterling Tower. Account holder, Sterling. First name, husband's name. Check payment history for the last 12 months. Send it to my screen immediately. He hung up and turned back to me. Davison handles commercial leases. Been with me 20 years. Doesn't miss a thing. We waited. The only sound was the quiet hum of the building and the distant city traffic. My father's attention was now entirely focused on the screen of his computer, which was positioned so I couldn't see it. His expression didn't change, but his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He murmured. Interesting. He looked at me. He's 3 months behind on rent. And there were significant unauthorized modifications made to the suite last year without approval or permits. Knocked down a non-load-bearing wall to expand his reception area. Never submitted plans. Major breach. 3 months behind. Unauthorized modifications. His kingdom, built on a foundation of lies and borrowed time. The arrogance was staggering. He was strutting around like the king of his domain, while quietly failing to pay the landlord, while breaking the rules of the very building that gave him his perceived status. He's in clear breach of the lease agreement, my father stated, his voice firm. Multiple counts. Default provisions are straightforward. He looked at me again, his expression unreadable. What do you want me to do? This was the moment. The turning point wasn't just realizing the connection, it was making the final decision to act, to use this leverage and asking for it directly. I want him out, I said, my voice stronger than I expected. From the building. From his office. I want the lease terminated. Immediately. My father nodded slowly. He didn't ask about our marriage, about divorce, about my plans. He understood the core issue. This man had threatened my security, mocked my inability to survive, while simultaneously building his own precarious perch on my father's property and failing to meet his basic obligations as a tenant. It was a clear-cut case of leverage of consequence. Very well, he said. He pressed the intercom button again. Davison. Prepare a notice of lease termination for Sterling, Suite 2605. Effective immediately due to multiple breaches, including rental arrears and unauthorized alterations. Standard protocol. Arrange for security escort. I want him out by end of day today. And Davison. His voice dropped slightly, becoming colder. I will be there. Personal matter. He looked at me. Today, he asked, confirming. Today, I affirmed. The fear was still there, but it was overshadowed by a surge of cold determination. This wasn't revenge, it was correction. It was showing the man who thought he controlled my future that he couldn't even control his own present. The deepening crisis then became about execution. The hours leading up to the eviction were agonizingly slow. I went home, packed a small bag of essentials, and left the apartment. I didn't tell him I was leaving. I just left. The silence of the empty rooms, the lingering scent of his cologne, felt oppressive. I drove around aimlessly for a while, adrenaline making my hands shake. I thought about the words he had thrown at me. Homeless by next month. He had weaponized my deepest fears, based on a false premise of his own invincibility. I knew my father would handle it professionally. He wouldn't grandstand. It would be business. Efficient. Ruthless. But within the confines of the contract. That was his way. But I needed to be there. I needed to see it. Not to gloat, but to witness the moment the foundation of his arrogance crumbled. To see the look on his face when he realized the extent of his blindness, his folly. I parked across the street from the Sterling Tower an hour before the time my father had specified. The building loomed, tall and indifferent. People streamed in and out, tiny figures going about their normal lives, unaware of the quiet drama about to unfold within its walls. I watched the entrance, my heart pounding against my ribs like a trapped bird. My father arrived shortly after, not in his usual chauffeured car, but driving himself, pulling up to the curb with Mr. Davison in the passenger seat. They looked like any two businessmen, serious and composed. They got out and walked into the building. I gave them a few minutes, then followed. The office floor was exactly as I had pictured from his descriptions, sleek, modern, expensive-looking. His company name was displayed prominently on the door of Suite 2605. Inside, through the glass panels, I could see people working at desks, the low hum of a busy office. It looked like a place of success, of power. A place where a man might feel untouchable. I positioned myself in the hallway, a little distance away, near the elevators. Just another visitor, waiting. I watched as my father and Mr. Davison approached his office door. A receptionist, a young woman with a bright smile, greeted them. My father spoke briefly, showing some identification. The receptionist's smile faltered. She pointed towards his office. My father and Davison walked in. The door closed behind them. The wait felt like an eternity. Every second stretched, thick and slow. I listened to the muffled sounds from the office. Voices, phones ringing, keyboards clicking. Normal life continuing unaware. What was happening in there? Was he arguing? Blustering? Was he already turning pale? Then the door opened. And that's when I saw him. Standing in the doorway, flanked by the two security guards, his face a mask of disbelief, the color gone. The air in the hallway suddenly felt sharp, too cold. Davison's voice was low, professional, delivering the sentence. The notice of termination. The 15 minutes to collect personal belongings. The escort. He sputtered, tried to argue, but his words were meaningless against the quiet authority of the men delivering the news. He was talking about his business, his livelihood, his reputation. They were talking about a lease, a contract, a clear breach. Two different languages, one backed by paper and law, the other by pure, desperate ego. And then his eyes found mine. Across the hall. The confusion. The dawning horror. The freezing realization. He saw me. He saw my father's face behind Davison, stern and unyielding. He saw the building names subtly displayed on the elevator bank behind me. Sterling Tower. Owned by Sterling Properties. Owned by my father. The man who had promised me homelessness, who had mocked my vulnerability, who had built his empire of cruelty on the sand of his own delusions, was being dismantled, brick by brick, in the hallway of the building owned by my family. He had never bothered to learn the details of his own lease, the name of his landlord, the true foundation of his professional life. He had been so focused on his own reflection in the polished surfaces of his office that he never looked down to see whose ground he stood on. He froze. Utterly. The guards had to gently steer him towards his office door. He stumbled slightly, like a man waking from a vivid nightmare into a harsher reality. He glanced back at me one last time before disappearing into the room, his eyes wide and vacant. In that look, I saw not anger, but a profound, shattering shock. He hadn't just been evicted, he had been blindsided by the source. I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. My presence was the statement. I watched the office door close, then turned and walked calmly towards the elevators. I didn't wait to see him escorted out, tie askew, box in hand. I didn't need to. The image of his frozen face, the stark realization in his eyes, was already seared into my memory. The aftermath was quiet. There was no dramatic confrontation, no shouting match. Just the sterile efficiency of the process. He was removed from the building. His office was locked. His access terminated. His carefully constructed world, based on a foundation he didn't understand, had imploded. I didn't go back to the apartment. I stayed with a friend for a few days. The silence was strange at first, the absence of his constant low-level abuse almost unnerving. Then came the calls, the texts, furious, disbelieving, pleading. How could I do this? How could my father do this? Did I know what this meant for his business? His reputation? I didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. He was still focused on himself, on his losses, unable or unwilling to see the consequences of his own actions, the cruelty he had inflicted, the fear he had tried to instill. He was experiencing his own version of homelessness now, not physical but professional, a sudden, stark displacement from the place where he felt most powerful. My father never asked for details about the divorce, which followed quickly and relatively cleanly, surprisingly. Without his precious office, the symbol of his success, much of his bluster evaporated. The legal proceedings were just legal. Contracts, assets, division. The emotional battle had already been won, not in a courtroom, but in a sterile office hallway, with a look of frozen shock. I started rebuilding. My business slowly recovered. I found a new apartment, smaller but filled with sunlight and a sense of peace I hadn't realized was missing. The knot of fear in my stomach began to loosen. The threat of homelessness, the one he had conjured and wielded like a weapon, dissolved. I was never going to be homeless. Not because I had my father's safety net, but because I had my own resilience, my own capability, my own quiet strength he had so thoroughly underestimated. The experience changed me. It left scars, certainly. The casual cruelty of someone you loved leaves a permanent mark. But it also left a core of gong. A quiet understanding of power, not the loud, arrogant kind he craved, but the silent, structural power of ownership, of knowledge, of consequence. The power of knowing whose ground you stand on. He thought my world would crumble without him. He never imagined that his world was built on my foundation. He never saw the threads connecting my quiet life to the quiet, immense power of the man who owned the very air he breathed in his ivory tower. He mocked me, predicted my downfall, completely blind to the fact that the architect of his own undoing was standing right beside him all along, patiently waiting for the right moment to simply remove the floor beneath his feet. The silence now is not empty, but full. Full of possibility, of peace, of the quiet satisfaction of having faced the storm and found my own strength, not in fleeing it, but in strategically letting it break against a hidden, solid wall. The man who said I would be homeless by next month was the one left standing outside, tie askew, staring into the ruins of his own making. If this story hit close to home, if you've ever felt trapped or underestimated, I'd love to hear your version. Drop a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is. Thanks for being here. Subscribing helps bring more of these to life.